During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union hunted for ways to one-up the other side, be it through technological advancements, economic sabotage, or nuclear arms. But one method that was arguably utilized the most was the exploitation of various small foreign conflicts in order to gain footholds in various places globally. These conflicts were known as proxy wars. There were many proxy wars that were fought in the late 20th century, but none nearly as horrific as the one fought in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a dark period in Southeast Asian and American history. Fought between a communist North and a capitalist South, both supported their respective superpowers. It claimed the lives of 3.8 million people and scarred a generation of both American and Vietnamese soldiers. The war ended in a northern victory and led to the reunification of Vietnam under a communist system. But in this video, I'll be talking about a scenario in which they didn't win, and instead, the capitalist South Vietnamese, along with the United States, came out victorious. But quickly first, some context. Relations between the US and Vietnam technically began in the early 1800s when they established ties with the kingdom, but then forgot all about it when France decided to invade and take over Indochina. Vietnam was then ruled by the French for nearly a century before the Japanese invaded it in World War II. During the Japanese occupation, a communist group known as the Viet Minh was formed under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The group then rebelled, and once the Japanese were defeated, declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Viet Minh were not done though. They soon extended their war to the French, beginning the First Indochina War. This fight started just as the Cold War was boiling, and so naturally the communist DRV was backed by the USSR and China, while the French was supported by the British and the Americans. The Vietnamese in the south were then reorganized, and the state of Vietnam was founded under US support. The US, however, didn't send troops at first. After a Viet Minh victory against the French, the Geneva Accords took place, where it was decided that just like Korea, Vietnam would be split between a communist North and a capitalist South, while the rest of Indochina would be given independence as Cambodia and Laos respectively. After the split, a referendum was held in Vietnam deciding whether or not they should reunify. The results, however, were very fishy, with over 98% of Southerners opting to remain independent. And with that, the Republic of Vietnam became official. This pissed off the North, and war was declared, beginning the Second Indochina War, or in other words, the Vietnam War. The US was much more aware of this war than before, as now, support for the North by the communist powers was much stronger. The domino theory was created, which was a belief that, if Vietnam fell to the Reds, then communism would spread across Southeast Asia and eventually even India, and the Americans just couldn't have that. In South Vietnam, communists were purged en masse by the government. This persecution eventually led to the founding of the National Liberation Organization, or NLF, in 1960 by various Southern communists and Northern sympathizers. The North Vietnamese supported the NLF via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. During the 1960s, US President Kennedy suffered embarrassments with the building of the Berlin Wall, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and the rise of communism in Laos. Because of this, Vietnam became a good place for the US to redeem their image, though they didn't send troops on the ground immediately. In 1963, the South Vietnam Army launched a coup, taking over the southern government. In the chaos that ensued, the NLF managed to gain more favor with the people. When Lyndon B. Johnson became the new US president, the CIA began recruiting more South Vietnamese soldiers to carry out their attacks on the North. LBJ found ways for the US to get more involved without a formal declaration of war. Over the course of the 1960s, after the 1964 election, more boots arrived on the ground, and soon the government introduced the draft, where in the event of gaps opening up in the army, the military could fill it by forcing young men to fight. Resistance to this draft was both illegal and futile. The war went on, and both sides got desperate. The US began using a new bomb called napalm, which devastated forests, and the draft got even worse once Richard Nixon became president. Both Cambodia and Laos were also invaded by both sides in order to try and gain leverage over the other. Foreign intervention was also ramped up with the inclusion of the SEATO into the war. By now, the US population was growing angry. Calls for peace and voting rights for young people began being made, and Nixon started calling for more troops to be pulled out of Vietnam, believing the South needed to fend more for itself. The draft ended in 1973. From there, South Vietnam struggled due to lack of aid and oil shortages. The North used this, and in 1975, they launched their spring offensive, slicing through the country and leading to a mass evacuation by sea of South Vietnamese citizens. The US frantically evacuated their embassy in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon as the city was being closed in by the MLF and the Northern armies. Eventually, the city fell, and so did the South, ending the Vietnam War in a North Vietnamese victory. Vietnam reunified under a communist system, with Saigon being renamed to Ho Chi Minh. In the first decades after the war, the country struggled financially and had to economically liberalize a bit, becoming more capitalistic by the modern day. The Vietnam War sent ripples through the defeated US, with millions of veterans demoralized and traumatized. To this day, people still think back to the time when a superpower like the US couldn't even defeat a small Southeast Asian country. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate timeline, the United States and South Vietnam managed to gain a victory over North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, reunifying Vietnam under the Southern government? What if South Vietnam won the Vietnam War? Once again, we have three new points of divergence. For the first one, the 1963 coup in South Vietnam would need to not happen in order to keep the South in a more stable position. Number two, the Ho Chi Minh Trail would need to be destroyed from an early point. The best way to do this would be for the US to invade and occupy Laos and Cambodia, completely choking the trail with their army. And finally, for the third POD, though it's unrealistic, China would need to not come to the aid of North Vietnam when the US finally turns the tables and launches a full-scale invasion. With all of that done and dusted, here's the timeline. The Second Indochina War starts as it did in our world in 1955 between the North and the South, and goes exactly the same way up until 1963, when the coup that happened in our timeline doesn't happen here, allowing for America's army to be much more coordinated in the long run. Between 1964 and 66, the US Army began invading and occupying parts of Cambodia and Laos in order to thoroughly destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and curb all Viet Cong and North Vietnamese plans and advances. LBJ also does a better job at getting American troops on the ground quickly and effectively, reinforcing American bases in the South, and eventually causing the Americans to go on the offensive. In late 1966, the US Army carries out an extreme bombing campaign of northern dikes, as well as one final push into North Vietnam, and the city of Hanoi comes under siege by February of 1967. Surprisingly, China, too worried with its domestic affairs, and on slightly bad terms with the North Vietnamese, does not do much to intervene in this conflict, and North Vietnam soon falls. The 76-year-old Ho Chi Minh is publicly executed by guillotine a couple weeks later by the Southern Army, and Vietnam reunifies under the Republic, ending the Vietnam War in an American and South Vietnamese victory. Celebrations erupt across the US as more troops from Vietnam are brought home. A wave of patriotism spreads, and the anti-war and counterculture movements soon start to fade into obscurity. In the 1968 elections, the Republicans don't nominate Richard Nixon due to him not being able to stand on a platform of de-escalating the Vietnam War like in our timeline. Instead, the Republicans nominate Nelson Rockefeller, who loses quite miserably to LBJ, who decides to seek re-election in this timeline due to his high approval ratings thanks to the war. Overall, the Americans would have a pretty pro-war attitude going into the 1970s, possibly leading the US to escalate conflicts in Rhodesia, Nicaragua, and Angola. Nixon never being president means that the Watergate scandal would never happen, and people would have more trust in the US government, potentially allowing the Equal Rights Amendment to be passed into law, becoming this timeline's 27th Amendment. Meanwhile in Asia, the USSR, angry at China's lack of action in the Vietnam War, would slowly start to cut ties, speeding up the Sino-Soviet split. With Indochina firmly under American influence, the domino effect would die out as a common theory in the US, and fears of communism spreading in the Pacific would simmer down. In fact, there may even be a reversed version of it arising among the communist countries in the early 70s. This blue scare in the East would prompt China to become more protective over North Korea, with them keeping the country militarily backed up against South Korea and the US, while the USSR would double down on press freedom like never before. In 1969, the US and Vietnam would invade Laos in order to bring the Laotian Civil War to a quick end and restore the Kingdom of Laos. As for Cambodia, they would remain under US occupation for some time and would never experience the civil war they did in our world. This means that the Khmer Rouge would never come to power, which means no Pol Pot, and in turn no Cambodian genocide. In the 1972 election, the Democrat George McGovern would defeat the Republican Spiro Agnew and would become the 37th U.S. president. He'd probably only serve one term, though, due to the effects of the Arabian oil embargo, and would be defeated by Ronald Reagan in 1976. This means that the Iran hostage crisis in 1980 would happen under the Reagan administration rather than the Carter administration. Ronald Reagan, backed up by America's more nationalistic approach to foreign policy, would pressure Iran much more to release the hostages. Iran would probably refuse, and the US would begin arming Iraq, while Iran seeks help from the Soviets, turning the Iran-Iraq war into yet another proxy war. This war would demand a victor, which would likely be Iraq. The theocratic government in Iran would collapse, along with the USSR in the early 1990s, allowing Iraq to sweep in and take some small territories along the border. The rest of Iran would become a democratic republic after a short yet destabilizing revolution. The effects of these changes in the Middle East would really start to show after 9/11 and during the War on Terror, when the various Islamic terror groups would use Iraq and even Iran as major bases, causing the US to crack down harder. Now on to how this timeline would affect Vietnam itself. After the execution of Ho Chi Minh, the reunited Vietnam would experience their own reign of terror, with the communists across the country being purged in the thousands. Any remaining militant communists, like the Viet Cong, would likely go underground and would start forming militias. It would most likely take the rest of the century for Vietnam and the US to stamp out this insurgency, with the last militias being wiped out in as late as 2006. Due to the Blue Scare, China would militarize their border with Vietnam significantly. The Republic of Vietnam would likely spend the rest of the Cold War under a dictatorship before beginning to loosen up and liberalize in the late 1980s to early 90s after political changes, soon becoming a democracy by the 2000s. With this, Vietnamese markets would open more, turning Vietnam into a cultural center. They would still join ASEAN and would probably still keep SEATO running longer. Vietnam would be a strong US ally and would be much more resistant to China's 9-dash line. By 2023, Vietnam, much like it is in our world, would be a pretty prosperous country within Southeast Asia. On the topic of culture, the 1970s would look very different to us, at least in America. Due to the absence of the hippie movement, many things all the way down to clothing, music, and color patterns would have changed, looking less like this and more like this. It's also worth pointing out that, again, with no Nixon or Red Scare, the CIA wouldn't see much of a need to overthrow various democratically elected governments in Latin and South America through Operation Condor, meaning countries like Chile and Nicaragua would be much more stable in the 21st century. Overall, while this timeline does have many flaws, it also has its upsides. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to live in this alternate timeline. Thank you all for watching, be sure to subscribe, and recommend future scenarios that I can do in the comments. See ya!